45 men have held the supreme power of the United States. When they die, the nation mourns, and their coffins are draped in the stars and stripes, all of them, except one. John Tyler is the only president in history to die as a sworn enemy of the country he once led. There was no state funeral for him, only the calculated silence of a government that wished to erase him. He had traveled the unthinkable distance from the White House to the Confederate Congress, trading the presidency for a seat in a rebellion against Abraham Lincoln, mocked in life by both parties as his Accidency, and branded in death as a traitor. He remains the darkest fracture in the American lineage, the guardian of the Constitution who eventually became its assassin. John Tyler was born on March 29, 1790. The date itself is significant. The United States was in its infancy. George Washington was just 1 year into his first term as president. The Constitution was a fragile, experimental document, the ink barely dry, its authority still questioned by many of the very men who had fought for independence. Tyler was born into the Greenway Plantation in Charles City County, Virginia, a world of velvet gentility built upon a foundation of brutality. The Tyler family was not merely wealthy, they were the aristocracy of the New World. They were part of the first families of Virginia, a social caste that viewed itself as the legitimate heirs to the British gentry. They lived in a world of high-ceiling silver tea services and leather-bound books, all sustained by the labor of enslaved human beings who toiled in the tobacco and wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. The psychology of John Tyler was carved by the landscape of his childhood. It was a place of isolation and supremacy. The plantation was its own universe, its own sovereign state. The master of the plantation was the law, the judge, and the jury. There was no federal government breathing down their necks. There was only the rhythm of the seasons and the absolute authority of the Father. This environment bred a specific type of mind, independent, haughty, and deeply suspicious of any outside power that sought to interfere with their dominion. Young John Tyler inhaled this air of sovereignty with his first breath. He learned before he could even speak that his primary allegiance was not to a vague concept called America, but to Virginia, to Charles City County, and to the soil of Greenway. But the most powerful force in John Tyler's life was not the land. It was the man who ruled it. Judge John Tyler Sr. was a titan of Virginia politics, a roommate of Thomas Jefferson at the College of William and Mary, and a man of terrifying conviction. If the sun is the father's shadow, then John Tyler was living in a total eclipse. Judge Tyler was not just a patriot. He was a radical anti-federalist. He belonged to that group of revolutionaries who believed that the American Revolution was fought to free the colonies from a central empire, not to create a new one in Washington, D.C. He viewed the Constitution of 1787 not as a glorious achievement, but as a potential trap, a gilded cage that would eventually crush the liberties of the individual states. One specific moment in Judge Tyler's life cast a shadow that would stretch all the way to 1861. During the Virginia Ratifying Convention, where the state debated whether to adopt the U.S. Constitution, Judge Tyler stood up, his face flushed with righteous anger. He looked at the document that would create the presidency, the very office his son would one day hold, and he trembled with rage. He famously declared that he would sooner chop off his right hand than sign the Constitution without the addition of a Bill of Rights to protect the states. Growing up with that image, young John Tyler did not just respect his father, he worshipped him. He saw a father who equated compromising with the federal government to physical mutilation, framing political disagreement in terms of bodily sacrifice and moral absolutism. He absorbed this hatred of centralized power as if it were a religious dogma. He learned that the federal government was a necessary evil at best and a tyranny at worst. He learned that the Union was merely a contract, a business arrangement between sovereign states, and like any contract, it could be voided if the terms were violated. This was the poison in the milk. The treason of 1861 was not a sudden decision. It was the inevitable blooming of a seed planted in 1790. The father cast a long shadow, but the son cast a thin one. Physically, young John Tyler was a stark contrast to the robust, earthy image of the Virginia planter. He was frail, agonizingly thin, and plagued by health issues that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Historical records indicate he suffered from chronic diarrhea and a weak stomach, ailments that often left him bedridden and exhausted. In a time when physical vitality was often equated with moral strength, Tyler's frailty forced him inward. He could not dominate the physical world, so he resolved to dominate the intellectual one. He became a creature of the mind. He compensated for his weak body with a sharp, rigid intellect and an obsession with self-control. He was a beautiful boy with delicate features, a prominent Roman nose that gave him an air of classical authority, and silky brown hair. He was soft-spoken, charming, and musically gifted, spending hours playing the violin. But beneath this poetic exterior lay a spine of steel. Unable to fight with his fists, the boy learned to fight with rules. He becomes obsessed with the law because the law is the only weapon that puts the weak on equal footing with the strong. Tyler clung to the Constitution, specifically his father's strict interpretation of it, as a shield. If he followed the rules perfectly, if he never deviated from the text, he was safe. He was powerful. His education was designed to reinforce this worldview. At the age of 12, he was sent to the preparatory school of the College of William and Mary. It was here that he first encountered the intellectual heavyweights of the Enlightenment, but he filtered them through the lens of Southern aristocracy. He read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which had been published the same year as the Declaration of Independence. From Smith, he took the lessons of free trade and hostility toward government regulation, ideas that would later fuel his war against the national banks. He read Shakespeare, developing a taste for the tragic and the dramatic, seeing himself as a player on a grand stage. But tragedy struck early, cracking the foundation of his world. When John was just 7 years old, his mother, Mary Murat Armistead, collapsed. It was a stroke, sudden and devastating. One moment she was the mistress of Greenway, the gentle counterbalance to his father's fiery intensity. The next, she was gone. The death of a mother at such a formative age often leaves a permanent scar, a fear of abandonment and a craving for stability. For Tyler, the loss of his mother seemed to drive him deeper into the arms of his father's ideology. The father became the sole pole star of his existence. To please the father, to emulate the father, became the primary directive of his life. He entered the College of William and Mary as a full undergraduate in 1802, at the absurdly young age of 12. By 17, he had graduated. This was not merely a sign of intelligence, it was a sign of a rushed maturity. He had no true childhood. He was a small adult, groomed for power, groomed for leadership, groomed to defend Virginia. The William and Mary of the early 19th century was a hotbed of radical thought and occasional unrest. It was a place where the sons of the elite drank, gambled, and debated the future of the Republic. Tyler navigated this world with a strange mix of aloofness and charm. He was popular, yet distant. He was one of the boys, yet always seemingly observing from a detached height. After graduation, he returned to Greenway to study law. In those days, there were no formal law schools in the modern sense. One read law under the tutelage of an established master. And who better to teach John Tyler the law than the man who had threatened to cut off his own hand to defy it? He studied under his father and later under Edmund Randolph, the former Attorney General of the United States. This is a critical detail. Edmund Randolph was a giant of American history, but he was also a man who had his own complex, often tortured relationship with federal power. From these two mentors, Tyler learned a specific brand of legal theory: strict constructionism. It was a legal fundamentalism. It held that the federal government could only do what was explicitly written in the Constitution, not a word more. If the Constitution didn't say the government could build a road, then building a road was tyranny. If it didn't say the government could charter a bank, then a bank was illegal. It was a binary world, black and white, right and wrong. There was no room for the gray areas where real governance usually happens. For a young man with a rigid mind and a desire for order, this philosophy was seductive. It provided an answer for everything. It was a fortress. But there was a darker lesson embedded in his legal training, one that would fester until it destroyed his reputation. He learned that the protection of property was the highest duty of the law, and in Virginia in 1810, property meant human beings. Tyler was not a cruel master in the sadistic sense. Historical accounts suggest he viewed himself as a benevolent patriarch. He fancied himself a father figure to the enslaved people on his plantation, deluding himself with the myth of the happy slave. He wrote poetry about the beauty of the plantation life, completely blind to the horror that sustained it. This cognitive dissonance, the ability to champion liberty while owning human beings, was the central paradox of his class. But for Tyler, it wasn't a paradox. It was the natural order. He believed that the federal government had no right to interfere with this property. Any attempt to touch slavery was, in his mind, an assault on liberty itself. By 1809, at the age of 19, John Tyler was ready to take his place in the world. He applied for admission to the Virginia bar. The judge who examined him neglected to ask his age, or perhaps knowing he was a Tyler, simply didn't care. He was admitted to practice law before he was legally old enough to vote. He was a prodigy. He was brilliant. He was charming. And he was dangerous. He was a loaded weapon aimed at the heart of any institution that would dare to challenge the sovereignty of Virginia. As he stood on the precipice of his political career, the United States was drifting toward its second war with Great Britain, the War of 1812. The country was angry, divided, and anxious. It was the perfect stage for a young man who spoke with the fire of the ancients and carried the conviction of a zealot. He stepped out of the shadow of Greenway Plantation and into the sunlight of public life, bringing with him the ghosts of his father's prejudices. He looked like the future. He spoke like the past. And as he walked toward the Virginia House of Delegates in 1811, unaware that he would one day hold the keys to the White House, the tragic machinery of his life began to turn. He believed he was marching toward glory, but in reality he was marching toward a hotel room in Richmond, where he would die a stranger to his own country. The accidental president was no accident at all. He was the inevitable result of a system that valued pride over unity and abstract principle over human reality. The fatal flaw was already there, woven into his DNA, waiting for the right moment to snap. The psychological fortress was now complete, a mind fortified by rigid legalism and fierce Southern pride. But that fortress was about to be besieged by the chaotic realities of American democracy. As he stepped onto the national stage, the zealot became the political chameleon. For 3 turbulent decades, Tyler ascended through the halls of power, seemingly changing his colors, shifting his alliances, and shaking hands with men he secretly despised. To the casual observer of the early 19th century, his trajectory appeared to be the steady rise of a brilliant statesman, climbing every rung of the political ladder from state representative to militia captain, from congressman to governor, and finally to the vice presidency. But looking for the truth beneath the resume reveals a different narrative. This was not a climb, it was a drift. Tyler was a man unmoored, floating on the violent tides of a changing nation, belonging nowhere and to no one. He was a Democrat who loathed the leader of the Democratic Party. He was a Whig who despised the fundamental principles of the Whig platform. He walked into every room wearing a mask, convincing those around him that he was their ally, only to reveal, often too late, that his only true allegiance was to a vanished version of Virginia. By the time the masks fell away, the country would realize they had handed the keys of the republic to a man who viewed the federal government as an enemy to be contained, not a vehicle for progress. The year 1811 marked his entry into the arena. Europe was engulfed in the flames of the Napoleonic Wars, and the United States stood shivering in the shadow of a rematch with the British Empire. In Richmond, a 21-year-old John Tyler walked onto the floor of the Virginia House of Delegates, the youngest member of the body. He was physically unimposing, thin to the point of spectral, his blue frock coat hanging loosely on a frame racked by chronic illness. Yet when he spoke, the room fell silent, captivated by the Tyler voice, a silvery, melodic instrument that possessed the uncanny ability to make the driest legal arguments sound like divine sermons. His early political identity was simple and uncompromising. He was the watchdog of Virginia, a sentinel standing guard against federal overreach. But his first true test was not legislative, it was martial. When the War of 1812 erupted and British troops burned the White House to a charred husk, panic swept through Richmond. Tyler, swept up in the patriotic fervor, organized a militia company known as the Charles City Rifles and was elected captain. It is here that we find the first instance of the dramatic irony that would stalk his life. Captain Tyler drilled his men in the humid fields, ruining his health and waiting for a glory that never came. His company was ordered to defend Richmond, but the British never marched on the city. Tyler's military career consisted entirely of waiting for a phantom battle, fighting nothing but dysentery and boredom, eventually resigning his commission, having never fired a shot in anger. He returned to politics with the title of captain, a hollow credential for a phantom war, yet another mask for the intellectual who preferred legal briefs to bayonets. In 1816, he arrived in Washington, D.C., as a member of the House of Representatives, entering a city that was still a swampy, half-built village reeking of sewage and raw ambition. It was here that Tyler faced the nation's first true existential crisis, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The question was simple and terrifying. Should slavery be allowed to expand into the vast new territories of the West? The North screamed no. The South screamed yes. The Union threatened to crack apart 40 years before the Civil War. John Tyler stood up in the House and delivered an argument that reveals the terrifying depth of his self-delusion, a philosophy that underpinned his entire tragedy. He argued for the expansion of slavery, but he did so using a twisted humanitarian logic known as diffusion. He told the Northern congressman that expanding the geographic footprint of slavery was actually the best way to end it. He posited that if slavery were confined to the South, the concentration of enslaved people would become dangerous and cruel, But if allowed to spread across the continent, the enslaved population would be diffused, their conditions would improve, and the institution would eventually evaporate. It was a fantasy, a lie he told himself to reconcile his image as a lover of liberty with his reality as a slave owner. He voted against the Missouri Compromise, not because it allowed slavery, but because it restricted it anywhere. In his mind, he was defending the Constitution's silence on the issue. In reality, he was defending the chains of millions, proving early on that he preferred a broken country to a compromise principle. By 1827, after a stint as a ceremonial governor of Virginia, where he eulogized the dying giants Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, Tyler was elected to the U.S. Senate. This is where the tragedy shifts into high gear, for this is where he met his nemesis, the man who would define his political life by sheer opposition, Andrew Jackson. When Tyler entered the Senate, Jackson was the rising sun of American politics, a rough-hewn Westerner, a duelist, a man of violence and passion who believed the president was the tribune of the people. Tyler, the Tidewater aristocrat, believed the president was merely a clerk for the Constitution. Initially, Tyler supported Jackson simply because the alternative was John Quincy Adams, a man who wanted to use federal money for internal improvements like roads and canals, an abomination to Tyler's strict constructionist sensibilities. But the alliance was doomed from the start. The fatal flaw of John Tyler, his inability to bend, was destined to collide with the immovable object of Andrew Jackson's will. The break happened in slow motion, agonizing, and public. First came the spoils system, with Jackson firing federal employees to replace them with loyalists, which Tyler viewed as an attack on the purity of government. Then came the nullification crisis, where South Carolina threatened to secede over tariffs and Jackson threatened to hang the traitors. As the Senate floor crackled with the electricity of imminent civil war, most Southern senators fled the chamber to avoid the vote on the force bill, which authorized military action against South Carolina. But John Tyler stayed. In a scene of immense dramatic weight, as the clerk called the roll in the dimly lit chamber, Tyler stood up, pale, shaking but resolute, and voted no. The final tally was 32-1. He was the only senator in the United States to vote against giving the president the power to preserve the Union by force. He had drawn a line in the sand, declaring he would rather see the Union dissolve than see a president use a bayonet to hold it together. The final rupture came with the bank war. Though Tyler hated the national bank as unconstitutional, he hated Jackson's lawless removal of federal deposits even more. He voted to censure the president, an act that got him expelled from the Democratic Party and labeled a political leper. The breaking point arrived in 1836, a moment that serves as the key to his soul. The Virginia legislature, now controlled by Jackson's allies, sent instructions to Tyler, ordering him to vote to expunge the censure of Jackson from the Senate record. They were asking him to erase history, to admit he was wrong. Most politicians would have found a loophole or compromised. Tyler did neither. On February the 29th, 1836, he wrote a letter of resignation, handed it to the vice president, and walked away from one of the most powerful positions in America rather than violate his conscience. It was a gesture of antique nobility, Roman in its stoicism. He sacrificed his career for his principles, but in doing so, he removed the only moderate voice from the room, leaving the Senate to the fanatics. He retreated to his porch in Williamsburg, a 46-year-old private citizen, convinced his life was over. But the newly formed Whig Party, a chaotic coalition of everyone who hated Jackson, saw an opportunity. They didn't see a rigid ideologue, they saw a martyr. They needed a Southerner to balance their ticket for the 1840 election, someone to calm the fears of slaveholders. They picked John Tyler, never bothering to ask if he actually agreed with their policies. The election of 1840 was the first modern political circus, the log cabin and hard cider campaign. The Whigs sold William Henry Harrison as a simple frontiersman and Tyler as his faithful, harmless sidekick. They chanted the slogan, "Tippecanoe and Tyler too," in the streets, a rhythm that reduced Tyler to an afterthought, a spare tire in the trunk of the campaign. Tyler campaigned quietly, giving speeches that were masterpieces of ambiguity, letting the Whigs believe he was their man. They won in a landslide. On March 4th, 1841, as Harrison gave a 2-hour inaugural address in the freezing rain, John Tyler took the oath as vice president and retreated to his room thinking he had reached a safe harbor. He planned to spend 4 quiet years as a distant observer. He did not know that the man he had just seen sworn in was dying. He did not know that the Constitution was about to be tested as never before. The political chameleon had successfully blended into the background, fooling the Whigs, the voters, and perhaps even himself. He went home to play marbles with his children, unaware that the messenger was already saddling the horse and that he was about to be thrust into the presidency not by the ballot, but by the cold hand of death. The chameleon was about to shed his skin for the last time, revealing the iron statue underneath. The city of Washington in the spring of 1841 was not a seat of imperial majesty. It was a mud-choked necropolis of ambition waiting for the sun to rise. The log cabin and hard cider campaign had been a drunken, delirious carnival that swept the nation, promising a return to simple virtues and robust leadership. But as the euphoria faded, a damp, ominous chill settled over the capital. The Whigs had won. They had defeated the tyranny of the Democrats. They had installed their hero, General William Henry Harrison, in the White House. But history, with its grim sense of irony, was about to play a trick that no one had accounted for in their political calculations: the fragility of the human body. The tragedy began with a gesture of vanity. On Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1841, the weather was abominable. A cold rain lashed the city, turning the unpaved avenues into rivers of sludge. General Harrison, 68 years old and eager to prove he was not the senile relic his enemies claimed, refused to wear a coat or a hat. He rode a white horse to the Capitol like a conquering Caesar and proceeded to deliver the longest inaugural address in American history, a sprawling 2-hour lecture on Roman history and executive humility, shouted into the teeth of a freezing gale. He wanted to show strength. Instead, he courted death. For the next 3 weeks, the new president was besieged, not by foreign armies, but by office seekers. The White House was not a fortress. It was a public thoroughfare. Men climbed through the windows, slept in the hallways, and grabbed the president by his lapels, demanding postmasterships in obscure towns. Harrison was exhausted, his immune system shattered by the stress and the cold. On March 26th, he complained of a chill. The doctors arrived, the best medical minds of the 19th century, and proceeded to torture the dying man with the barbaric standard of care of the era. They blistered his chest with hot cups. They fed him opium and castor oil. They even applied boiled petroleum and snakeweed. They effectively poisoned him in an attempt to cure him. On April 4th, 1841, just 31 days after taking the oath, William Henry Harrison stopped breathing. He murmured his final words, a delirious plea to the Constitution. "Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more." The silence that followed was terrifying. It was not just the silence of death. It was the silence of the unknown. For the first time in the history of the United States, a president had died in office. The Constitution, usually so precise, suddenly looked like a map with a giant hole in the center. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6 stated that in case of death, the powers and duties of the office shall devolve on the Vice President, but it did not say the office itself devolved. The distinction was metaphysical but crucial. Was John Tyler now the president? Or was he merely the vice president acting as president, a temporary caretaker, a regent keeping the seat warm until a new election could be held? The cabinet, led by the formidable Secretary of State Daniel Webster, a man with eyes like burning coal and a voice like thunder, had an immediate answer. They decided that Tyler was not the president. He was vice president acting president. They viewed him as a subordinate, a figurehead who could be controlled by the cabinet's majority vote. They prepared to govern by committee, effectively turning the American executive branch into a parliamentary council. They sent a messenger to Williamsburg, not to summon a new leader, but to fetch a puppet. While Washington panicked, John Tyler was at his home in Williamsburg, completely unaware that his life had just collapsed. The image is striking in its domestic banality. The future traitor was on his knees on the parlor floor, playing a game of marbles with his sons. He was wearing a plain country coat. He was debt-ridden, worried about his crops, and looking forward to a quiet 4 years of irrelevance. The vice presidency was supposed to be his retirement, a soft landing for a tired politician. At dawn on April 5th, the heavy thud of hooves broke the silence of the Tyler plantation. Fletcher Webster, the son of the Secretary of State, pounded on the door. When Tyler opened it, bleary-eyed and confused, he was handed the letter. He read it in silence. Harrison was dead. The government was in crisis. He was needed in Washington immediately. We can only speculate on the thoughts that raced through his mind during the long, grueling carriage ride and steamboat journey back to the Capitol. A weaker man would have been terrified. A more ambitious man would have been celebratory. But Tyler was neither. He was a lawyer. As the carriage rattled over the rutted roads of Virginia, he wasn't thinking about power in the abstract. He was parsing the text of the Constitution in his mind. He knew the cabinet viewed him as an accident. He knew the Whig leadership, specifically Henry Clay, viewed him as a mistake. He knew they would try to strip him of the title. By the time he arrived in Washington, his jaw was set. He went directly to the Indian Queen Hotel and summoned a local judge to administer the presidential oath of office. This was his first act of rebellion. The cabinet had told him it wasn't necessary, that his oath as vice president was sufficient for a caretaker. Tyler ignored them. By taking the specific oath of the president, he was making a legal declaration. I am not a substitute. I am the thing itself. The climax of this constitutional drama occurred on April 6th in the first meeting of the cabinet. The room was thick with tension. These were the great men of the age, Webster, Ewing, Badger, Granger. They looked at Tyler, this thin, aristocratic Virginian with the long nose and the soft voice, and they saw a lightweight. Daniel Webster, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed he should have been president, informed Tyler of the Harrison custom. He explained that under Harrison all policy decisions were put to a vote, and the president had only one vote, just like the secretaries. The implication was clear. We will tell you what to do, Mr. Tyler, and you will sign the papers. The air in the room seemed to freeze. This was the moment of the fatal flaw turning into a saving grace. Tyler's monumental arrogance, his absolute refusal to be dictated to, saved the American presidency from becoming a weak, subservient institution. Tyler stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not look for consensus. He looked at Webster, the giant, and delivered a speech that should be etched in granite. I beg your pardon, gentlemen. I am very glad to have in my cabinet such able statesmen as you have proved yourselves to be, and I shall be pleased to avail myself of your counsel and advice. But I can never consent to being dictated to as to what I shall or shall not do. I, as president, shall be responsible for my administration. I hope to have your hearty cooperation in carrying out its measures. So long as you see fit to do this, I shall be glad to have you with me. When you think otherwise, your resignations will be accepted. Your resignations will be accepted? It was a polite, gentlemanly way of saying, I'm the king here. Fall in line or get out. The cabinet was stunned into silence. They had expected a mouse and found a rattlesnake. Tyler had unilaterally decided the constitutional crisis. He declared that when a president dies, the vice president does not just inherit the duties, he inherits the office, the title, and the full, unadulterated power of the executive. This was the Tyler precedent. It was not written in the Constitution. It was forged in the fire of Tyler's will. It would stand for 126 years until it was finally codified in the 25th Amendment in 1967. Every vice president who has ascended to the office since, Millard Fillmore, Andrew Johnson, Teddy Roosevelt, LBJ, owes their authority to the stubborn pride of John Tyler in that room. But declaring power is one thing, keeping it is another. The backlash was immediate and visceral. Henry Clay, the great compromiser who led the Whig Party in Congress, was apoplectic. He famously shouted, "Tyler dares not resist me. I will drive him before me." Clay regarded Tyler as a regent, a subordinate who existed to sign the Whig agenda into law. When Tyler refused to play the role of the obedient servant, the psychological warfare began. This warfare took the form of names. In the press, he was dubbed his Accidency. It was a cruel moniker, stripping him of legitimacy, reducing his presidency to a cosmic mistake. He was called the usurper, the executive ass, and the misfit. But the most insidious attacks came through the mail. Tyler began to receive hundreds of letters from his enemies, congressmen, senators, and powerful Whig donors, addressed with deliberate disrespect. The envelopes read, "To the acting President of the United States," or "To Vice President Tyler. Here, the true character of the man is revealed." A pragmatist would have opened the letters, read the insults, and moved on. A politician would have laughed it off. Tyler did something else. He instructed his secretaries to examine every envelope that arrived at the White House. If a letter was addressed to acting president, it was not to be opened. It was to be returned to the sender unread. The scene played out daily. A stack of mail sitting on the president's desk. Urgent correspondence regarding the bank crisis, treaties with Britain, appointments to the courts. But because the sender had omitted the word president, Tyler refused to acknowledge its existence. It was petty, it was childish, but it was also profoundly symbolic. He was asserting that the office he held was indivisible. You could not respect the office while disrespecting the man holding it. He forced his enemies to say his name, to write his title, or to scream into the void. One famous anecdote involves a letter from Henry Clay himself, the most powerful man in the legislature. Clay sent a missive addressed to Vice President Tyler. Tyler sent it back. Clay, furious, sent it again, addressed to the acting president. Tyler sent it back again. Finally, grinding his teeth, Clay sent it addressed to the president. Tyler opened it, read the contents, and arguably threw it in the fire. He had won the battle of titles, even as he was losing the war for his political soul. This period, the 31 days and the immediate aftermath, was the high water mark of John Tyler's life. It was the moment where his rigidity served the nation. He filled a dangerous vacuum with his own ego. If he had been a weaker man, if he had accepted the title of acting president, the United States might have evolved into a parliamentary system where the executive is weak and the Congress is supreme. The balance of power we know today was preserved by a man who would later try to destroy the very government he was leading. But as the summer of 1841 approached, the adrenaline of the crisis began to fade and the reality of his position set in. He was a president without a mandate. He was a captain who had seized the ship, but the crew was mutinous. The Whigs in Congress were preparing a legislative agenda that they knew Tyler hated: a new national bank, higher tariffs, federal spending. They were loading a cannon and pointing it at the White House, daring him to stand in the way. Tyler sat in his office, the ghost of Harrison still lingering in the hallways, the smell of the acting president letters still fresh in his memory. He knew what was coming. He knew that to survive he would have to fight not just the Democrats, but the very party that elected him. He stroked his chin, his eyes hard and cold. He had saved the presidency, yes, but to save his own conscience, he was about to blow up his administration. The accident was about to become a catastrophe. The unopened letters were just the first skirmish in a war that would leave him the loneliest man in America. The sun was setting on the era of good feelings, and the long, dark night of the veto was about to begin. If the first months of John Tyler's presidency were a legal thriller, the years that followed were a political horror story. The summer of 1841 brought with it a heat that suffocated the capital, turning the swampy grounds of Washington into a breeding ground for malaria and malice. The honeymoon period, if it ever truly existed, evaporated like mist on the Potomac. John Tyler sat in the White House, the accidental king, and watched as his own creators prepared to destroy him. The architect of this destruction was Henry Clay. Clay was the leader of the Whig Party in the Senate, a man of towering ambition who believed with almost religious fervor that the presidency belonged to him by right. He viewed Tyler not as a partner but as a temporary obstruction, a speed bump on his road to power. Clay's strategy was simple and brutal. He would pass a series of bills to reestablish the Bank of the United States, the very institution Tyler had spent his entire life opposing, and dare the president to veto them. If Tyler signed, he would be Clay's puppet. If he vetoed, he would be a traitor to the party. It was a trap designed to break the president's will. But Clay had miscalculated the depth of Tyler's stubbornness. The fatal flaw, that rigid, uncompromising adherence to principle, was about to turn the executive branch into a fortress. In August 1841, Congress passed the bill to charter the Fiscal Bank of the United States. It was the centerpiece of the Whig agenda, the holy grail of American finance. They sent it to the president's desk with a smirk. Tyler didn't hesitate. He dipped his quill in the ink and wrote the word veto. He sent the bill back to Congress with a message arguing that the Constitution did not grant the federal government the power to create corporations in the states. The reaction was volcanic. The Whigs, furious but undeterred, wrote a second bill. They changed the name to the Fiscal Corporation, tweaked a few clauses, and claimed it met the president's objections. It was a lie. It was the same bank in a different suit. They passed it and sent it back to the White House. On September 9, 1841, John Tyler vetoed the second bank bill. That night, the mob came. Outside the White House gates, the atmosphere was terrifying. It was not a gathering of concerned citizens. It was a drunken, violent rabble fueled by whiskey and political rage. They carried torches that cast long, dancing shadows against the white pillars of the executive mansion. They dragged a scarecrow stuffed with straw, dressed in old clothes, with a sign around its neck that read, Tyler. As the president watched from the darkened windows of the second floor, they set the effigy on fire. He watched himself burn. The flames licked the night sky, and the crowd chanted, Huzzah for Clay, down with the Vado. Stones clattered against the portico. It was a scene of anarchy, a visceral demonstration of just how alone he really was. 2 days later, on September 11th, the political assassination attempt moved from the streets to the cabinet room. Tyler convened a meeting of his cabinet, the men he had inherited from Harrison, the men who had tried to downgrade him to acting president. He expected a tense discussion. What he got was a choreographed coup. One by one, the secretaries stood up. Thomas Ewing, the Secretary of the Treasury; John Bell, the Secretary of War; George Badger, the Secretary of the Navy; Francis Granger, the Postmaster General. They recited pre-written letters of resignation. They didn't just quit. They staged a walkout. It was designed to humiliate the president, to strip him of his government, to leave him naked and powerless before the world. They believed that without a cabinet, the government would collapse and Tyler would be forced to resign. Tyler sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of stone. He watched them leave. He didn't beg. He didn't argue. He simply nodded. Only one man remained in his chair, Daniel Webster, the Secretary of State. Webster was a Whig, but he was also a snob who hated Henry Clay more than he hated Tyler. He looked at the empty chairs, then at the president, and said, "Where am I to go, Mr. President?" Tyler looked at him and said, "You must decide that for yourself, Mr. Webster." Webster stayed, but he was the exception. The rest of the government had evaporated. 2 days later, the Whig Party officially expelled John Tyler. It was an unprecedented act of excommunication. A manifesto was published in the newspapers declaring that all political connection between the Whigs and John Tyler is at an end. The magnitude of this isolation was absolute. The Democrats hated him because he was a turncoat who had joined the Whigs. The Whigs hated him because he was a traitor who had vetoed their bank. He was a president without a party. He was a man on an island surrounded by sharks. The newspapers began to refer to him not as His Excellency, but as the executive ass. When a deadly strain of influenza swept through the country that winter, people didn't call it the flu. They called it the Tyler grip. They blamed him for the sickness in their lungs. And amidst this public crucifixion, tragedy struck his private heart. His wife, Letitia Christian Tyler, had been a silent, suffering ghost in the White House. Paralyzed by a stroke years earlier, she had remained in her upstairs bedroom, only coming down once to attend her daughter's wedding. She was the anchor of his old life, the connection to the simpler days of the plantation. In September 1842, she suffered another stroke and died. Tyler was now a widower, a pariah, and a failure. The White House became a mausoleum. He wandered the halls at night, the sound of his own footsteps echoing in the emptiness. He wrote letters to his children that were filled with self-pity and stoic resolve. He felt the world was conspiring to crush him. But John Tyler was a creature of resilience, or perhaps delusion. In the midst of his grief, he found a new obsession: Texas. If he couldn't fix the economy, if he couldn't unite the parties, he would expand the map. He would bring the Lone Star Republic into the Union. It was a dangerous gamble. Texas was a slave republic. Annexing it would enrage the North and potentially trigger a war with Mexico. But Tyler didn't care. He needed a legacy. He needed a win. And he needed a companion. Into this void stepped a figure of dazzling, chaotic life, Julia Gardiner. She was 24 years old. Tyler was 54. She was the Rose of Long Island, a wealthy, vivacious, stunningly beautiful socialite who had scandalized New York society by posing for a department store advertisement. She was everything Letitia was not: loud, modern, ambitious, and hungry for the spotlight. Tyler fell madly, embarrassingly in love. He chased her like a schoolboy. He wrote her terrible poetry. He proposed to her repeatedly. She laughed him off. After all, he was an old man with a long nose and a ruined reputation. Why would the most eligible bachelorette in America marry the most hated man in America? It took an explosion to change her mind. February 28th, 1844. A day that began with champagne and ended in blood. The president had commissioned a new warship, the USS Princeton. It was a marvel of modern technology, a steam-powered screw sloop that represented the future of the American Navy. But its pride and joy was a gun, a massive wrought iron cannon named the Peacemaker. It was the largest naval gun in the world, capable of firing a 225-pound ball over 2 miles. To celebrate, Tyler hosted a grand cruise down the Potomac. The elite of Washington were there: senators, diplomats, cabinet members, and the Gardner family. The mood was electric. The Peacemaker was fired once. The crowd cheered. It was fired again. The concussion shook the ship. The power was intoxicating. As the ship turned back toward Washington, the captain, Robert Stockton, decided to fire the gun one last time as a salute to George Washington's home, Mount Vernon. The guests crowded onto the deck. They wanted to be close to the power. They wanted to feel the boom. John Tyler started to head up the ladder to the deck. He wanted to see the shot, but at the last second he paused. Someone, perhaps a guest, perhaps his son-in-law, started singing a song in the cabin below. It was an old drinking song called Old Rosanne the Bow. Tyler loved music. He stopped. He turned back. He stayed below to listen to the verse. That decision, a whim, a moment of distraction, altered history. Above him, the order was given: fire! The gun did not fire. It exploded. The breech of the cannon, weakened by the heat of the previous shots, blew apart with the force of a bomb. Thousands of pounds of jagged, red-hot iron shrapnel scythed through the crowd of dignitaries. The scene on the deck was apocalyptical. There was no smoke at first, only a stunned silence, followed by the screams of the dying. Secretary of State Abel Upshur was killed instantly, his body mangled beyond recognition. Secretary of the Navy Thomas Gilmer was dead, crushed by the debris. Virgil Maxey, a diplomat, was severed in two. David Gardner, Julia's father, was struck down, dead before he hit the deck. Below, Tyler heard the dull thud, not the sharp crack of a successful shot. He rushed up the ladder. He emerged into a slaughterhouse. The deck was slippery with blood. The President of the United States, the man who was supposedly cursed, had survived because of a song. He found Julia Gardner weeping over the body of her father. In that moment of shared trauma, the dynamic shifted. The playful flirtation ended. The desperate reality began. He lifted her into his arms. He carried her off the ship. In her grief, she turned to the only figure of authority and stability left in her world. The explosion that killed her father birthed her marriage. They were married 4 months later in a secret ceremony in New York. The press was scandalized. The president and the flirt. But for Tyler, it was a rebirth. With Julia by his side, he found a new energy. He spent the final year of his presidency with a maniacal focus on Texas. He used the full power of his office, bypassing the treaty process that required a 2/3 vote in the Senate, which he knew he would never get, and instead pushed for a joint resolution, which only required a simple majority. It was a legal trick, a loophole, but it worked. On his final days in office in 1845, John Tyler signed the bill annexing Texas. He had expanded the United States by thousands of square miles. He had defied the Whigs. He had defied the Democrats. He had defied the odds. But the victory was poisoned. The annexation of Texas enraged the abolitionists. It tipped the delicate balance of the country toward the slave power. It made the Civil War not just possible, but probable. On March 4th, 1845, John Tyler left the White House. He did not attend the inauguration of his successor, James K. Polk. He simply packed his bags and rode to the train station. He was leaving Washington not as a hero, but as an enigma. He had saved the power of the presidency, but he had fractured the soul of the nation. He retreated to Sherwood Forest, his plantation. He thought he was done with history. He thought he would spend the rest of his days as a country squire, raising his new children with Julia, telling stories about the vetoes and the bank war. But history wasn't done with him. The fatal flaw was still there, dormant, waiting for the final test. The man who had been the man without a party was about to become the man without a country. The isolation of 1841 was nothing compared to the treason of 1861. The final act of the tragedy was yet to be written, and it would be written in the blood of his fellow countrymen. When John Tyler left the White House on that cold morning in March 1845, he did not head north to the bustling cities of industry, nor did he linger in the capital that had despised him. He headed south, back to the Tidewater, back to the red clay of Virginia. He purchased a sprawling plantation on the banks of the James River, a place of ancient oaks and silent fields. With a wry sense of humor that history often overlooks, he named the estate Sherwood Forest. It was a deliberate joke. He saw himself as Robin Hood, an outlaw, a man who had been declared an enemy of the state by both the Whig and Democratic sheriffs in Washington. He was the exiled bandit king, retreating to his woods to lick his wounds. For the next 15 years, the man who had held the nuclear codes of the 19th century, the command of the Army and Navy, became a farmer. To the outside world, it looked like a peaceful retirement. He grew wheat and corn. He managed his property, the dozens of enslaved men and women whose labor sustained his lifestyle. He became a biological phenomenon, fathering 7 more children with his young wife Julia, bringing his total progeny to 15. He holds the record to this day as the most prolific father in presidential history. The image of Tyler at the head of his dinner table, surrounded by a small army of children who spanned 2 generations, is almost comical. But beneath this domestic tranquility, the fatal flaw was festering. Sherwood Forest was not just a home, it was an echo chamber. Tyler spent these years reading, writing, and watching the news from the North with growing horror. He watched as the abolitionist movement grew from a fringe whisper into a roaring political force. He watched as the North industrialized, outpacing the agrarian South in population and power. To a man like Tyler, raised on the gospel of Thomas Jefferson, this was not progress. It was a nightmare. He believed that the North was violating the sacred contract of the Constitution. He believed that they were trying to turn the federal government into a weapon to crush the Southern way of life. The roots of his treason are exposed in the ink and paper of his letters from the 1850s. They are not the ravings of a madman. They are the cold, calculated logic of a man who feels cornered. When John Brown raided Harper's Ferry in 1859 trying to incite a slave rebellion, Tyler was terrified. He didn't see Brown as a lone fanatic. He saw him as the vanguard of a northern invasion. He began to organize a local militia guard, the Silver Grays, composed of old men ready to defend their homes. A former president of the United States stood on his porch with a musket, scanning the horizon for enemies coming from his own country. Then came the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln. To us, Lincoln is the great emancipator, the saint of democracy. To John Tyler, Lincoln was the Antichrist. Tyler viewed the Republican Party not as a political rival, but as a revolutionary organization dedicated to the destruction of the South. When Lincoln won the election, without carrying a single Southern state, Tyler believed the compact of the Union was broken. The South, he argued, was now a subject colony ruled by a hostile Northern majority. But here is where the tragedy becomes complex. Tyler did not immediately call for war. In fact, for a brief shimmering moment in early 1861, he emerged from his forest as a savior. The Deep South, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, had already seceded. The border states, including his beloved Virginia, were teetering on the edge. The nation was holding its breath. In this vacuum, John Tyler published a letter calling for a peace convention. He proposed a gathering of all the states to hammer out a compromise, a final effort to save the Union and avoid bloodshed. It seemed like a redemption arc, the old Roman returning to save the republic he had once led. He was unanimously elected president of the Peace Convention. In February 1861, at the age of 70, he traveled to Washington, D.C. for the first time in 16 years. But this is where the mask slips. If you look at the public records, you see Tyler the peacemaker banging the gavel, calling for brotherhood. But if you read his private correspondence to his wife Julia during those same weeks, you see a man who had already given up. He wrote to her with a chilling cynicism. He described the convention as a shabby assembly. He called the Northern delegates stubborn fanatics. He wasn't there to negotiate in good faith. He was there to prove a point. He wanted to show Virginia that the North could not be reasoned with. He was sabotaging the peace process by setting impossible standards. He demanded that the North guarantee the protection of slavery in all current and future territories, a demand he knew the Republicans could never accept. On February 27, 1861, the Peace Convention collapsed, its proposals watered down and ignored by Congress. Tyler met with President-elect Lincoln at the Willard Hotel. It was a meeting of ghosts. The ghost of the past, Tyler, and the ghost of the future, Lincoln. Tyler urged Lincoln to avoid war, to let the South go in peace. Lincoln, polite but immovable, replied that the Constitution must be enforced. Tyler left the meeting with a dark certainty. He returned to the convention floor and delivered a speech that sounded like a funeral dirge for the United States. He declared that the time for talk was over. He rushed back to Richmond not to rest but to ignite a revolution. The Virginia Secession Convention was in session. The state was divided. Many Virginians loved the Union. They were the state of Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. They did not want to leave. John Tyler took the floor. He was frail, his voice trembling with age and emotion, but his rhetoric was sharper than a bayonet. He threw his immense prestige, the prestige of a former president, onto the scales of secession. He told the delegates that sticking with the Union was suicide. He painted a picture of a future where Virginia was a slave to the North. "The Union is gone," he thundered. "It is a thing of the past. The only question now is, where does Virginia belong?" On April 17, 1861, days after the firing on Fort Sumter, the vote was cast. Virginia seceded, and then John Tyler did the unthinkable. Throughout history, former leaders have often disagreed with their governments. They have protested, they have gone into exile, but they have rarely taken up arms against the flag they once saluted. John Tyler did not just support secession, he joined the enemy government. In November 1861, he was elected to the House of Representatives of the Confederate States of America. The weight of this betrayal was crushing. This was a man who had placed his hand on the Bible and sworn to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Now, he was preparing to travel to the Confederate capital to write laws for a nation dedicated to destroying that Constitution. He wasn't forced. He wasn't a senile old man led astray. He was clear-eyed. He believed in the deepest recess of his soul that he was the true patriot. He believed that the United States of 1861 had become the tyranny his father had warned him about in 1790. He believed that by destroying the Union, he was saving the idea of liberty, even if that liberty was built on the backs of enslaved people. It was a tragedy of perspective. To the north, he was Benedict Arnold. To the south, he was George Washington reborn. But in reality, he was neither. He was a man who had allowed his fatal flaw, his obsession with the rights of the state over the needs of the whole, to lead him into the abyss of treason. He prepared his bags for one last journey. He said goodbye to Sherwood Forest. He kissed Julia and his 15 children. He was going to Richmond to take his seat in the Confederate Congress. He envisioned a new career, a second act as a founding father of a new republic. He did not know that he was traveling to his deathbed. He did not know that he would never hear the gavel bang in the Confederate House. The outlaw of Sherwood Forest was riding toward a final judgment that no voters could control. The sky over Virginia was gray and heavy with snow. The war had begun. The fields where he had played as a boy were being churned into mud by the boots of marching armies. And John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, rode past the Union lines, past the flag of his fathers, and into the darkness of rebellion. The city of Richmond in January 1862 was a place of grim determination and festering anxiety. It was no longer just the capital of Virginia. It was the capital of a new precarious nation, the Confederate States of America. The streets were churned into a freezing slurry of mud and horse manure, crowded with soldiers in mismatched gray uniforms, politicians seeking favor, and refugees fleeing the encroaching Union armies. The air smelled of wet wool, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of impending violence. Into this cauldron rode John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, now the duly elected representative for the 2nd District of Virginia in the Confederate Congress. He arrived at the Exchange Hotel, a grand, imposing structure that had become the pulsating heart of the rebellion's political life. The hotel was a hive of whispers and smoke, where the fate of the South was debated over brandy and cigars. Tyler checked into a room on the 2nd floor. He was 71 years old. His body, always frail, was now a brittle cage of bones held together by sheer willpower. He had come to take his seat, to help craft the laws that would sever the South from the North forever. He believed he was witnessing the birth of a new Rome. In reality, he had checked into his own mausoleum. The fatal flaw that had driven his life, the rigid intellectual abstraction that placed principle above reality, was about to meet the harsh physical truth of mortality. On the morning of January 12, 1862, Tyler awoke feeling a strange pressure in his head. It was not pain, but a displacement, a sense that the world was tilting on its axis. He had suffered from health issues his entire life, dysentery, colds, weakness. But this was different. He went down to the dining room for breakfast, trying to maintain the facade of the old Romaine. He sipped his tea. He looked around the room at the young officers, men who were going to die for the cause he had championed. Suddenly the room spun. The Tyler voice, that silver instrument that had charmed senates and seduced a woman 30 years his junior, failed him. He collapsed. He was carried back to his room. The doctors were summoned. In the 1860s, medicine was still a dark art of guesswork. They diagnosed him with bilious fever and a congestion of the liver. They dosed him with morphine and brandy. But the detective looking at the symptoms today sees the clear signs of a massive stroke. The brain that had parsed the Constitution, that had outmaneuvered Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, was shutting down. For 6 days, John Tyler lay in that hotel room, drifting between two worlds. The room was stiflingly hot, heated by a coal fire that dried out the air. The sounds of the bustling city outside, the tramping of boots, the shouting of newsboys, filtered through the window, a muffled reminder of the war he had helped ignite. His young wife, Julia, rushed from Sherwood Forest to be by his side. She sat by the bed holding the hand that had signed the annexation of Texas, the hand that had vetoed the bank, the hand that had signed the ordinance of secession. In his delirium, did he see the ghosts of his past? Did he see Andrew Jackson mocking him with a wild grin? Did he see the faces of the men killed on the USS Princeton? Did he see the Union flag he had abandoned? We cannot know, but we know that his mind, usually so sharp and orderly, was fracturing. On the night of January 17th, his breathing became shallow. The death rattle, that terrifying fluid-filled sound of lungs failing, filled the small room. The doctors told Julia there was no hope. The end was near. At shortly after midnight on January 18, 1862, John Tyler opened his eyes one last time. He looked at the doctor. He took a small sip of brandy, and then, with the calm, detached clarity of a man who had spent his life analyzing legal texts, he spoke his final sentence. "Doctor, I am going. Perhaps it is best. Perhaps it is best." These words are haunted by philosophy. What did he mean? Did he realize in that final moment of clarity that he had made a mistake? Did he realize that he was dying on the wrong side of history? Or did he simply mean that it was better to die now than to live to see the South defeated, the plantations burned, and his world destroyed? It was a final, ambiguous verdict on his own life, a resignation letter to the universe. He closed his eyes. At 12:15 a.m., the heart of the 10th President of the United States stopped beating. What happened next is the most singular and disturbing event in the history of the American presidency. It is a study in dramatic irony, a tale of two cities responding to the death of the same man. In Richmond, the reaction was immediate and operatic. Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, declared a period of national mourning. He proclaimed Tyler a martyr to the cause of liberty. The body lay in state in the hall of the House of Delegates, the same room where Tyler had begun his political career 50 years earlier. Thousands of Virginians filed past the open casket. They saw the pale, waxen face of the patriarch of the Revolution. They wept. They saw him as a hero who had died fighting for their rights. On January 21st, the funeral procession began. It was a spectacle of imperial grandeur. 4 white horses drew the hearse, their hooves muffled in black cloth. A long line of carriages followed, carrying the entire Confederate government. The streets were lined with soldiers standing at attention. The Confederate flag, the stars and bars, was draped over the coffin. As they lowered him into the ground at Hollywood Cemetery, near the grave of James Monroe, cannons fired a salute. It was a hero's farewell. But look north, look to Washington, D.C. When the news of Tyler's death reached the Capitol via telegraph, it landed on the desk of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was a man of deep empathy. He wrote beautiful letters of condolence to the mothers of dead soldiers. He would later speak of malice toward none, with charity for all. But for John Tyler, there was no charity. Lincoln read the telegram. He set it aside, and he did nothing. There was no announcement from the White House, no press release, no order to lower the flags on federal buildings. The bells of the Washington National Cathedral remained silent. The Army bands did not play a dirge. It was a calculated, devastating silence. By ignoring Tyler's death, Lincoln was making a profound legal and political statement. If he acknowledged Tyler as a former president, he would be acknowledging the legitimacy of the Confederacy. He would be admitting that a U.S. president could be a traitor. So he chose to erase him. He treated John Tyler not as a fallen leader, but as a non-person, a ghost. The newspapers in the North were not so silent. They filled the void with vitriol. The New York Tribune wrote, "He has died a traitor to the government to which he once swore allegiance." The Cincinnati Commercial published a savage obituary. He was a poor, miserable, despised old man. He goes down to the grave with the brand of a traitor on his brow. Even the National Intelligencer, a paper that had once supported him, could only manage a cold two-sentence notice that noted his passing without a single word of praise. For the first time in American history, a president had died, and the government he led refused to admit he had ever existed. There was no monument commissioned, no statue planned. The federal government would not spend a single penny to mark his grave for 53 years. In Richmond, he was buried under a mountain of flowers. In Washington, he was buried under a mountain of shame. The man without a party had finally found a side, but in doing so, he had lost his country. He lay in the cold Virginia ground, the earth fresh and wet, while the Civil War raged on above him. The cannons that fired over his grave were not just ceremonial. They were the sounds of the war he had helped to provoke, a war that would eventually consume the very city where he lay. John Tyler had escaped the judgment of the voters. He had escaped the judgment of the Senate, but he could not escape the judgment of history. As the dirt was shoveled onto his coffin, the silence from the North was louder than the weeping in the South. It was the sound of a door slamming shut forever. The grave of John Tyler in Hollywood Cemetery sits on a quiet hillside overlooking the James River, the same river that flows past the plantation where he was born and the plantation where he died. For 53 years, there was no monument there, no marble column, no bronze plaque, no acknowledgement from the nation he had led. It was just a patch of grass in a defeated city, marked only by the silent judgment of the ages. When the United States government finally erected a stone in 1915, more than half a century after his death, it was an act of reluctant bureaucratic housekeeping, not honor. Even today, visitors who stumble upon it are often struck by a strange dissonance. The stone lists his titles, governor, senator, president, but it feels like a resume with a redacted final line. It tells us what he did, but it hides what he became. The verdict on John Tyler remains elusive. In the pantheon of American presidents, he is consistently relegated to the dark basement of history, sitting alongside James Buchanan and Andrew Johnson. But to label him merely bad is to miss the terrifying complexity of his tragedy. John Tyler was not incompetent. In fact, he was arguably one of the most effective executives to ever hold the office. In 4 years, without a party, without a welcoming Congress, and without a mandate, he reshaped the American map, opened the doors to China, and established the vital precedent that the vice president is not a temporary substitute, but a full possessor of power. Every time a modern vice president takes the oath after a tragedy, from LBJ on Air Force One to the present day, they are standing on the bedrock of John Tyler's stubbornness. So why is he hated? Why is he the ghost of the White House? The answer lies in the nature of betrayal. History forgives incompetence. It does not forgive treason. James Buchanan is despised because he let the Union break through inaction. He watched the House catch fire and did nothing. But John Tyler didn't just watch the fire, he grabbed a torch and helped to spread it. He is the only U.S. president to have actively organized, legislated, and worked for the destruction of the United States government. He is the only man to have sworn to protect the Constitution and then died an enemy combatant against it. This is his fatal flaw carried to its ultimate bloody conclusion. His rigid adherence to principle, his belief that his loyalty to Virginia outweighed his loyalty to the Union, transformed a man of the law into an outlaw. He proves that integrity without moral flexibility can become a dangerous weapon. He was a man so obsessed with the letter of the law that he murdered its spirit. Yet, there is one final piece of evidence that refuses to be buried. It is a fact so startling, so biologically and chronologically impossible that it feels like a glitch in the simulation of history. It is the revelatory moment that collapses the distance between the 18th century and the 21st century, proving that the past is not dead, it is not even past. John Tyler was born in 1790. George Washington was president. Mozart was still alive. The French Revolution was in its infancy. The United States was a strip of colonies huddled along the Atlantic. Yet his grandson, Harrison Ruffin Tyler, did not die in the Civil War, nor in the 1920s. Harrison Ruffin Tyler, the grandson of a man born in 1790, walked the earth until the very end of the digital age. Through a genetic anomaly of men having children late in life, the Tyler bloodline skipped across time like a stone across water. A man who was the living, breathing grandson of a president born in 1790 was walking the earth at the same time as artificial intelligence and Mars rovers. A single human chain of 3 links, grandfather, son, grandson, spans the entire history of the American Republic. This fact is not just trivia, it is a warning. It tells us that the ancient history of slavery, of the Civil War, of the treason of John Tyler, is not ancient at all. It is grandfather time. The wounds of the 1860s are not geological layers buried deep in the earth. They are fresh scratches on the surface of our skin. We like to think that we have evolved past the hatreds and divisions that drove Tyler to betray his country. We like to think that the Union is settled, that the question of loyalty is resolved. But when we realize that a man who sat on the knee of a child of the Confederacy was alive just yesterday, the comfort of distance evaporates. John Tyler's story is not a museum piece. It is a mirror. It reflects the eternal struggle between local identity and national unity, between rigid ideology and pragmatic compromise. John Tyler died believing he was a patriot of a new nation. He died wrong. He died a traitor to the only nation that mattered. But his story serves as a profound reminder of the fragility of the experiment. The United States is not a law of physics. It is a choice. It is a choice made every day by its leaders and its citizens. John Tyler made his choice. He chose the past over the future. He chose the plantation over the republic. And for that, history has sentenced him to the ultimate punishment. He is the president we try to forget, because remembering him forces us to see how close we all are to the edge of the abyss. The wind blows through the Hollywood cemetery. It rustles the leaves of the oak trees, trees that were saplings when Tyler was an old man. The grave is silent now. The accidental president sleeps in the soil of Virginia, a man who possessed the keys to the kingdom and threw them away. The story of John Tyler is the story of America's shadow, the reminder that the greatest threat to the Union usually comes not from without, but from within.